Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin at 4700 Grover Avenue. Our forums are free and open to the public, and we encourage you to attend. Today, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Ray Marshall, who will be discussing his vision of a progressive immigration program. Dr. Marshall is the holder of the Audrey and Bernard Rappaport Centennial Chair in Economics and Public Affairs at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at University of Texas in Austin. He is the author of more than 30 books and monographs, and he's written extensively on immigration policy, including migration and domestic labor markets. His latest book, in fact, he's produced 2 books in the past 2 years. His latest book is Migration and Domestic Labor Markets, Auctions and Employer Demand versus Public Policy in 2012. He's also written Value-Added Immigration, Lessons from Canada, Australia, and the UK. And in 2009, he wrote Immigration for Shared Prosperity. Secretary Marshall, well, I told you already, he is actually former Secretary of Labor. This was during the Carter administration. He also was a founder of the Economic Policy Institute. And I think it deserves mentioning also that he is a World War II veteran. So let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Ray Marshall.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's good to be back. I don't know if this is my 5th or 6th time that I've been here with you all at the First Unitarian Church, and I've always enjoyed it. What I'd like to do today is to discuss the comprehensive immigration reform for the United States, which is an extremely important subject for us. Timely in the sense that next week the President and the Congress will introduce outlines for their comprehensive immigration reform policies. I have been working with the White House and with Congress and groups who are interested in immigration reform fairly intensively for the last 5 or 6 years. Ever since the 2007 immigration reform bill failed in the Congress. When that happened, I decided to get back into immigration policy. I helped during the time that bill was being developed, but not intensively. And after it failed, I decided that we need to try to build consensus for a much better policy, and also to try to see if we couldn't build it in advance so that we could get it passed next time. The person who talked me into doing that was Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts, who said that if I could build consensus for the framework that I had outlined, that he thought we could get it passed. So I set about trying to do that, and have been doing that. And one of the most recent things I've done in that connection is to benchmark the economic policies of some relatively successful countries with immigration policy to see what we could learn from them about what would be useful and applicable to our situations. These are other countries that have become, like the United States, immigration nations, which means that they rely on immigration for economic and population growth. And that is actually fairly common, though all countries don't accept immigrants as much as we do, or as much as Canada, Australia, and belatedly the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not a traditional immigration nation, but during the 1980s and 90s, it has become an immigration nation. Now, in trying to learn from them. What you try to do, as you would with any benchmarking exercise, is to select countries that have been, or situations that have been relatively successful. One of my organizations that I have found and am active with is the Center for National Center on Education and Economic Policy, and we do a lot of benchmarking. We found that to be a very successful process. You have to be very careful with it, of course. You have to have deep understanding of the countries that you're benchmarking as well as your own in order to get an organic fit rather than an artificial fit, which you ordinarily do. You also have to be willing to learn from other people, which is not an American trait. We have a fair amount of hubris and therefore are unwilling to pay attention to other countries and can also always find reasons why we can't do what they did when they have been relatively successful. I don't believe that, but I believe that you have to be very careful with it. You have to adapt it to your own realities rather than to theirs. You have to understand, if you're talking about countries like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, to be alert to the similarities and to the differences between your situation and theirs. We have a lot of similarities with all three of those countries. One of the most important, as I've mentioned, is that we are all immigration nations now. A second one is we're all liberal democracies. That is, we're relatively open democratic systems, and we're all subject to the same economic, technological, and demographic realities. And that the demographic reality is the reason that immigration has become relatively important, and I'll say some more about that. The differences, of course, between the United States and these other countries is that we're much larger than they are. We have more resources than they have. A big difference that I've learned in trying to get things done is they're also all parliamentary democracies. And there are a lot of advantages in a parliamentary system relative to the system that we have in the United States. One of the most important from my perspective is none of them have filibusters. And none of them would allow what we do, which is the people who represent 10% of the population or less, I figure it's about 9, block the will of people who represent 90% of the population through filibuster. And they have much more unity in their government because their chief executive is elected by the parliament. The prime minister is elected by the parliament, and therefore you don't get the fight between the executive and the judiciary and the legislative as we do in this country, which makes it harder to get things done. They also have much better immigration policy, management of immigration, than we have, which is very important. And there are several manifestations of that. One is, of course, they have much less unauthorized immigration than we have. Our most important immigration policy right now is unauthorized immigration. We have, when I was responsible for immigration in the Carter administration, we estimated we had 2 to 3 million unauthorized immigrants. Now we estimate that we've got 11 or more million unauthorized immigrants. And that means it becomes increasingly difficult to resolve. It also means that the focus on unauthorized immigration makes it very difficult for us to develop an immigration policy that manages immigration much more effectively than we do, but that those countries do. So that's part of the reason to learn. Everybody agrees that our system is broken. We don't manage it very well. It does not serve the interest of anybody except immigration lawyers. very well. It does a good job for them. But there are more important things that they could be doing if we had a better managed system. Now, the reason that we ought to pay more attention to improving the immigration system is because of its importance to us. It has a number of, I'll just mention those, and during the question and answer, if you want to talk about them more, I'd be glad to explore them in greater depth. One obvious importance is political. The future of this country politically will be determined to a significant degree by what we do about immigration. And the reason for that is that among the rapidly growing populations, especially the Hispanic population, immigration is a gateway issue. It is the most important issue they face, and they're not going to get to other things until we deal with that. And we're not going to get to other things until we deal with that. The unauthorized immigration also makes it very hard for you to have a legal immigration system, because if employers, for example, have access to unauthorized immigrants, they would prefer to do that than going through the process of establishing a legal system and then meeting the requirements that they would have to meet if they relied on legal immigration. So politically, it's very important. The reason it's important is the rapidly growing nature of the immigrant populations. And, of course, the fastest growing is not the Hispanic, it's the Asian. And I would also point out that Barack Obama got a larger proportion of the Asian vote than he did the Hispanic vote, which is saying a lot, because he got 71% of the Hispanic vote, but he got 73% of the Asian vote. Now, those populations are not only growing rapidly, but they're strategically located. They're located in places where there's relatively even balance between Democrats and Republicans. The economic aspect of immigration is what I'd like to talk most about, and it has become very important for a variety of reasons. One is all of the industrialized countries now have declining native-born populations, ours less than most others. The Japanese, very serious problem for them, but it's a problem for everybody. And what that means is that if you don't have immigrants, your workforce is going to decline. About 62% of the growth of the U.S. workforce during this decade will come from immigrants. And therefore, what kind of immigrants we have and how they get integrated into the economy and population will have a strong bearing on our future, our economic future. The second part of the economic problem is that we, like many other industrialized countries, find that the native-born population tends to shun inferior jobs as low-wage, disagreeable jobs for many reasons, and therefore we have relied increasingly on immigrants to take those jobs. It's a debatable question of whether we should. I think we should not necessarily, but that's what we do, and that's what happens in Europe and the UK. Another important aspect of immigration is it will also determine, let me mention one other economic aspect, and that is that in the world that we're in now, the future belongs to the creative, the innovative. We're not going to compete in the globally market on wages. If we do that, we'll lose, because there are always countries with lower wages. And therefore, we have to produce things that other countries that we're competing with don't produce. We have to have value-added competition, which means that we concentrate on quality and productivity rather than trying to work harder. We work smarter. And one of the things that countries with large immigrant populations tend to have is a fair amount of creativity and entrepreneurship. We could discuss why that is, but the evidence shows that is the case. So that is an important aspect, economic aspect of immigration. Immigration also will have a lot to do with social stability in this country as well as in other countries. And by that I mean that if we want to get the advantages of immigration, we have to guard against the downside. The downside is religious, ethnic, racial conflict, which can be very deadly. And you can look at Europe now, which is experiencing the failure to adequately integrate immigrants into their population. The best example I know, and one of the reasons I benchmarked it, of a country that has done that well is Canada. The Canadians tend to have very limited opposition to immigration, and they have very limited conflict between ethnic groups within Canada. We could discuss why that is. I'd be glad to do that. My own theory of it is that because Canada very early had to deal with the secessionists in Quebec, they then had to work out a multicultural strategy and policy that has turned out to be very successful when they had to integrate other people into their economy. And they saw the value of that. They could see the downside because without doing that with Quebec, Canada would have split apart. And there was urgency that they do that. Immigration also has very important foreign policy implications, especially our relationship with Mexico and other countries in this hemisphere. How we handle immigration has a lot to say about the success of Mexico in developing its economy and in developing its polity as well as its society. It is to our advantage to have a prosperous, democratic Mexico on our border. And how we deal with immigration has a lot to do with whether or not that in fact happens. So let's look at these other countries and see what we can learn from them. First thing we need to say is, what is the evidence that they have been successful with their immigration policy? The first evidence I've already mentioned, and that is they have very little unauthorized immigration. Almost all their immigration is legal and therefore within the framework of the rule of law. Secondly, they tend to have a better match between the requirements of their workforce and of their economy and immigration. They manage it so that they don't have immigrants displacing natives or suppressing their wages, as we do. We don't manage that very well, so we have a pretty serious problem with it. The third evidence, and a very important set of facts for a democracy, is that they have very little public opposition to their policies. The exception to that is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a relative newcomer to immigration, as I've mentioned. They had zero net immigration up until the 1980s, which meant that out-migration just about matched immigration. The reason for that, of course, is that the UK has always had a lot of out-migration. That's how a lot of us got here, is depopulating the British Isles. And they had a balance up until the 1980s, but it's exploded since then, partly because UK became part of the European Union, and therefore people from the European Union were readily acceptable into the UK. The UK also made some miscalculations on how many people were likely to come from the new countries that came in after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the admission of the East European countries to the European Union. They estimated they would have between 5,000 and 13,000 immigrants from that, and they had well over 1 million. So that kind of miscalculation can cause you a lot of political problems if you're a government, and it costs a lot for them. They also have a lot of problems because the UK is one of the most compact and overpopulated part of the European Union. The density, population density is very high. And that means if you get a lot of immigrants, you get a lot of pressure on housing and a lot of other things. Having said that, though, there has been a fair amount of support for economic immigration in the United Kingdom and a lot of support for immigration in Canada and Australia. Now, what have they done to cause public acceptance and a good match and to prevent unauthorized immigration? Let me stress that point. One of the best ways to prevent unauthorized immigration is to have a well-managed legal immigration system. If you don't have a well-managed system, you will get large unauthorized immigration. What have they done to get public support and to manage the system very well? First thing they've done is to stress immigration that would support their value-added economic principles, which they adopted in the 1980s and 90s, and we did not. We continue to have a low-wage cost competition economic policy, which we still have. They rejected that because they thought it would cause lower and more unequal wages, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the entry of China and India into the global labor market. When that happened, the global labor market doubled in size to about 3 billion people. And what that meant was that Americans, British, Canadians, Australians were suddenly in direct competition with highly motivated, often well-educated people who worked for a fraction of what they made. And with the information technology, a lot of that work could be done over the internet, and that put great downward pressure on wages, including college-educated people. So if you're going to compete, it made sense to switch to a value-added strategy and not to try to continue to compete. But it also meant that you developed an immigration policy that reinforced your value-added economic policy. And how did they do that? Well, the first thing you recognize, economists don't agree on much, but one of the things we agree on is that if you bring in people who complement your workforce, everybody's better off because you fill jobs that you can't fill from the domestic workforce. And if people come in who don't depress your wages, everybody's better off. Whereas if you bring in people who compete with your workers, those who are the subject of the competition will have lower wages. And therefore you'll get more opposition to the system. So they protect domestic wages and working conditions. A third thing they do is to pay a lot of attention to the integration of immigrants, not only into the economy, which is very important, and they didn't do it overnight, as it took the Canadians and Australians a good while to figure out how to bring in people who complemented your own people. They had to develop some metrics and statistics and management systems in order to get that done. But they did it, and they have now worked it out so that it is relatively successful. Another thing they did, which we did not do, is to stress economic immigration rather than the other two forms of immigration, which are family-based and humanitarian, which are refugees and asylum seekers. We've got another category called diversity because we thought we weren't diverse enough, so we needed to set aside 55,000 positions for that, which to me doesn't make sense now, but is nevertheless what we do. So what the big difference between those countries and us is that 2/3 or more of our immigration is family-based, and 2/3 of theirs is economic-based. Now, back in the 1970s and 80s, they had large family-based immigration relative to economic-based. What caused them to change was the adoption of their value-added economic strategy. They said there are several things about family-based immigration that will detract from your value-added economic policy. One is that family-based immigration is much harder to manage, as we have found. See, we adopted our present policy in 1952 and 65, and when we emphasize family-based immigration, the assumption that the framers made is that most people would continue to come from Europe. That is a failure to understand both what was happening in Europe as well as what was happening in this hemisphere. What happened is they got chain immigration from the Western Hemisphere, and therefore very rapid increase in the populations from the third world countries, and especially from this hemisphere. And it has been very rapid. If you look at what's happened to the Mexican population, for example, it was 4.6 million in 1970 and 50.5 million now. That's a very rapid increase, and it comes because of family-based immigration. Now, I happen to think that's a good thing if we deal with the illegal immigration problem, but it nevertheless means if you're trying to manage the immigration system and you rely heavily on family-based immigration, the process determines it. In our case, it's because family-based immigrants have preference. They're not subject to the per-country quotas that we have. So you get a very rapid increase. They also find that you cannot determine the qualifications of those people and whether they fit your value-added strategy. Most countries have also found that family-based immigrants put much more pressure on your fiscal system. That is, if you have a generous welfare system like all three of these other countries do, and as we are increasingly doing, then there are fiscal impacts of large family-based immigration. So that's one of the reasons they switched and we didn't. We still give overwhelming weight to family-based. Another difference is they have very strong preference for skilled workers. And they have a bias in their systems against unskilled workers. Why? Well, they find that skilled workers tend to be more supportive of a value-added economic policy. They also are more likely to complement your native population, and they have less fiscal impact because they're able to take care of themselves. And a very important difference is that highly skilled people are less subject to abuse. One of the big problems with a low-skilled, unskilled immigration policy is that nobody has yet worked out a very effective way to keep those workers from being abused once they come here, being discriminated against, because they have limited options, because employers frequently prefer them, because in most of these systems those workers are indentured to employers and therefore unable to leave if they're legal, and therefore you have great difficulty protecting them. The next important thing about immigration, managing immigration for value added, is to have a good economic management system. And let me just tick off some things that are important about that. One is you've got to pass a good law as the basis of what you're doing. Now, a good law ought to meet several characteristics. It ought to be fair. It ought to be transparent. It ought to be enforceable. And it ought to be sensible. Our immigration law meets none of those characteristics. We passed a law in 1986 that could not be enforced. And the people who passed it knew it. As the co-author, Alan Simpson, knew that it couldn't be enforced. It was based on very unsound principles, and still is. One unsound principle is that you don't need to have an identifier for foreign workers that is foolproof and therefore can prove that they're in the country legally. I fought to get one of those, but failed to do it. Employers were opposed to it. The civil libertarians were opposed to it. but it was the only way to have an effective system that would make immigration legal rather than illegal. The second problem that we had with the 1986 Act is that we put employers in charge of enforcing it. We gave them 22 different ways to identify yourself, and I can buy you most of those to flea market out on 290 right now. And then you told the employer who wanted to hire foreign workers to determine whether or not these 22 different identifiers were legitimate or not. Well, they had neither the ability nor the will to do that. And the consequence of that was that we didn't do much about controlling unauthorized immigration up until after 9/11. Then we got excited about it after we created a big mess for ourselves, and we had serious problems. The third thing that we need, besides having a good law, the second thing is we need to have a strategic vision to guide economic policy, and theirs is guided by value-added economic policies. I would add one thing to that. My strategic vision would be that we have value-added economic policy and broadly shared prosperity. It makes a big difference whether or not you go back to the kind of broadly shared prosperity we had up until the 1980s, because we're getting lower real wages for most workers and greater inequality of wealth and income, which seems to me not to be sustainable in a democratic system. And therefore, that you need to have that strategic vision. Third thing is you need to have high-level government control of the system. Somebody needs to be in charge. Nobody is in charge of economic immigration in the United States. It's split between different departments. And why is that important? Because you need to be able to coordinate economic policy with other policies. If you don't do that, then you will let immigration substitute for education, as we're doing. Instead of educating and training workers, it's a lot easier to import foreign workers who are already trained. And if you've got that option, you'll tend to do that unless somebody tends to prevent it. These other countries tend to prevent it. We don't. You need to have a flexible system to adjust immigration to the needs of the workforce. We don't. We do it by act of Congress. That we fix the present quota for college-educated workers, the H-1B visa, in 1990. There's been a lot happened since 1990, and therefore that system doesn't work very well. We have to make good use of information technology and have smart regulations, and most of all, we need to have good data in order to be able to guide our economic policies, and we don't do that. We don't have good metrics to determine such things as, how do you know when you have adequate control of the border? There's no metric for that. And yet we can keep arguing about that forever if we don't have a metric to say, well, we know now that it's done. We need to agree on that and develop it. We need to have a metric for such things as, what are the characteristics of the workers who would be complementary to ours? How do you know you've got a shortage? We don't know if we've got a shortage or not. And I'll say some more about that. The other countries have developed good metrics, points-based systems, so that you can go online and see if you're qualified to be an immigrant to Canada or Australia, and fill out your own applications and know whether it works or not. Well, what does that tell us about what we ought to do? It tells us that we ought to pass a good law. It tells us that we ought to develop a strategic vision for what we want that law to do. It tells us that we ought to have a high-level federal responsibility for that. I would have at least a cabinet-level person, or at least an assistant secretary, sub-cabinet level, and preferably a cabinet-level person to do that. We also need to have an ad hoc high-level committee to recommend ways to improve the efficiency of our system, which is very inefficient. You're not going to do much to match the needs of the economy against workers if you've got a system as inefficient as ours, and if it's all done by a member of a congressional committee. But we need, therefore, to create an independent commission on foreign workers and labor markets that would produce data, analyses, and recommendations to the Congress and to the President about what the level of immigration and characteristics of immigration that we ought to have. That would do for immigration what the Federal Reserve Board does for monetary policy. Can you imagine what monetary policy would be like if it were made by a committee of the Congress? It'd be as bad as our immigration policy, which is made by a committee of the Congress. And the limits are set. Now, we need to be able to answer the question that I raised earlier. Do we have shortages or not? You can read in the paper every day. If you listen to Bill Gates, we've got a serious shortage of STEM workers, scientists, technologists, engineers, and math. What's the argument for that? What's the evidence that we have such shortages? Well, overall, you can say, as I have already mentioned, the demographics suggest that we will need to import immigrants because if we want to grow. That's pretty obvious. That doesn't mean that we need more scientists, technicians, engineers, and so forth. We need to know what kind of workers we need. The second evidence that we use is employer complaints. Employers say, Chuck Schumer, the senator who's now taken the Judiciary Committee and responsible for this, employers tell him they've got a shortage. Well, I've never seen an employer who thought he had a surplus of labor unless they wanted to lay people off. You can't rely on people who got vested interest in saying they got a shortage. You see in the media always that there is a shortage. Now, skeptics would point out the following. One bit of evidence they use is what happens to the H-1B visa, which when it's opened up in April. There are 85,000 of those for the private sector, 65,000 for regular, and 20,000 for people who have advanced degrees. And usually what happens is that during most times, the number of visas that get taken up are exhausted by sometime in May or even in April. That shows that we got a big shortage of college-educated workers, according to that theory. But it doesn't show you anything of the kind. What it shows you is that there's a high demand for indentured college-educated workers. Those workers are willing to work for less than you have to pay college-educated people in the United States. They are attached to a particular employer for up to 10 years. You have 2 3-year terms, and then if the employer recommends you for the green card, permanent residence, you can stay working for that employer until the green card comes through, and there's a big backlog for green cards. Now, if you're an employer and you've got rapid turnover, you've got several options. One, you can raise wages, which they're very reluctant to do. You know, in a competitive market, if you got a shortage, wages ought to be going up. Unemployment ought to be going down. They're going just in the opposite direction for college-educated people and for everybody else. Secondly, we already have a very large number of foreign workers in the STEM fields through students who stay in the United States, and people who get PhDs, most of them stay 10 years or longer. And therefore, the system that we got now is producing a fair number. They say we need to have more temporary foreign workers from Mexico. We have over 500,000 temporary foreign workers from Mexico under present arrangements every year, not in total. So now that causes you to be skeptical. I'm also skeptical because the unemployment rate for college-educated people doubled after when this recession started. From 2007, it went from about almost up to 5% to about 8.5%. Underemployment went to 19%. Wages fell by 4.6%. Only people today, college-educated people, who have higher real wages than they made in 2000 are men with PhDs. There's only a group of men. Women are not a good index because they're going into different jobs. And the wages for everybody else, real median incomes, have fallen during that time, which is not compatible with the argument that we've got a shortage of people. Now, what I conclude after looking at the skill part of it pretty closely, is that we might have a shortage in some occupations, and we need to have a commission to get at it to determine what they are, and it ought to be balanced in the sense that you get the evidence to support that argument, and then when you get it, you recommend it to the Congress, and then the Congress could either act on it or change it, and they would probably act on it because they don't want to change it. There's even less evidence that we've got a shortage of unskilled labor, especially if we're going to adjust the status of the unauthorized workers who are already here, which I think we should do, and especially if you did some things to improve the quality of those jobs that already exist. Now, let me conclude by saying that I think creating such a commission would be a very important part of should be an important part of comprehensive immigration reform. But there's some other things we need to do in order to do that. The most important other thing is to adjust the status of the 11 million or so people who are already here. As I mentioned, that's a gateway issue. We don't deal with that, we're not going to get to these other things. We're not going to get to a better managed immigration system. That's one of the most controversial of these things. People say, well, wouldn't that be rewarding lawbreakers? I say, well, yes, to some degree. If you had a good law, I would be more impressed with your argument. But the fact that we passed a bad law and you passed it, and knew it, some of you, all of you didn't know it, but some of you knew it. And then you would have to say that these unauthorized workers have a lot of co-conspirators who helped them adjust to this country. The Mexican government or their government, the IRS, which will give you a ID number to pay taxes, and people who hired the unauthorized workers, and people who ignored the law up until 9/11, until we created a large mess on our hands. People who were settled in, who had children, who were citizens. And now, what are you going to do with that 11 million people or more? I believe it's more. You're not going to have a roundup and deport all those people. That's not sensible, which is the last standard that you should make. The only sensible thing to do is to adjust their status and to impose some restrictions on them. I would impose restrictions that would help them adjust to and be integrate into the American economy and workforce, especially learning English. So that's one of the most important things that we've learned from these other countries about what you need to do if you're going to get integrated. So now, of course, there are all kinds of reasons to do it, because having people live outside the protection of your laws is not good for a democracy, and it makes it hard to enforce our existing laws. It offends the rule of law to have as many unauthorized immigrants as we have, and therefore I think we ought to do it, to adjust it. It requires a carefully coordinated combination of carrots and sticks in order to get it done. The carrot has to be, if you come forth and register, you get the right to stay in the United States and get at the end of the line or prepare for your integration. I would create a point system to let you prepare for the green card. If you don't come forth, there's a higher probability that you will be arrested and deported. And without that combination, the system won't work. The other thing you have to have before the system can work is another component. You've got to control the borders and internal system. I think the evidence right now is that what the facts support is that our borders are under operational control right now. Net illegal immigration in the United States is zero. Now, part of that's because of the recession, but part of it is because of increased enforcement. The federal government now spends more on immigration and border enforcement than all other federal law enforcement activities combined. And it has become the main federal law enforcement activity. I believe anybody who argues that we need to control the borders before we adjust the status has the burden of proof that the borders are not under control right now. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody gets through. That doesn't mean that you're not enforcing the law. No more than if you get a murder means that you're not enforcing the law against murder. You won't get them all. What you're trying to do is increase the probability you're getting most of them. But what they ought to do also is have priorities, which the administration has finally started doing, going after the really dangerous people, going after the smugglers, the drug dealers, and all the rest. Now, the reason that that's such an important part of your strategy is because you need the help of the population in order to be able to go after the bad guys. And if you go after everybody, you're not going to get the help of the people you need to enforce the law. That's the reason our chief of police here opposes that strategy of kind of roundup. Now, the other thing about it, of course, is we don't do a very good job of tracking people once they come into the country. We see who comes in, but we don't do much with who goes out. We don't do a very good job of controlling the workplace, which I would do with a biometric identifier. And the only thing the employer would have to do is take that, record it, and that would be valid. I wouldn't leave it up to him to decide, or her to decide if it's going to be valid. It's the government ought to decide if it's valid or not. And if we did all those things, I think we could go a long way towards having a well-managed immigration system that would give us the value of the system and avoid the downside of a system that is not well managed. Thank you.
Please. Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Please raise your hands high, and I will bring the microphone to you.
Yes, I'm Dale Beulah. I have two things. First of all, sustainable growth. Do any of these countries demonstrate sustainable population rather than constant growth? And then what do they do with their unauthorized immigrants?
Well, I think in order to get sustainable economic growth, you've got to have a balance between the needs of the economy and the workforce, one thing. The other thing you need to do is count all the cost of production. It costs you, if we don't internalize the cost of production to firms, they will shift those costs of environmental pollution and the safety and health of workers to the workers and to the environment. I would internalize those to the employers. Then I would go after the value added. I would try to impose a value added strategy. Now, what that means for the people we got is that we have imported into the United States the least educated foreign population of any of the industrialized countries because we hadn't paid any attention to that. Now, what do we need to do about that? First, we need to quit bringing in people to compete with them and keep driving their wages down. That's a very important part of it. Second, we need to do whatever we can to have a really good adult education system that would stress language. Texas probably has the worst adult education system in the United States. We're not even close to Florida or California, other countries with large. We are one of the few places that only does what is required by federal law for your adult education population. It costs us dearly in a system that gives heavy weight to education and training to have people who are not very well educated. Their upward mobility is very limited. What I would do is have a positive opportunity structure. People who want to do it could do it. You could work hard. You could make your way up through the system, which is what I had. You know, I'd like for everybody to have what I had. I was a junior high school dropout in World War II. Went into the Navy when I was 15 years old. Came out and got the GI Bill. Now, a lot of people say that shows we never should have done it. But the GI Bill is one of the most effective programs we ever developed. I had my staff calculate what the return to that for the federal government was. It was at least 5 times as much after 10 years as the federal government paid for it. They got back in taxes and reduced. The upper limit was 10. My staff said, "You want to refine it?" No, take the 5. You know, where else do you get that kind of return? Education is an investment. It's an investment in adults, just like it is in young people. And if we don't do it, we're going to be in big trouble in Texas, as we are. We don't see it yet because it gets camouflaged with growth. But I think if we want to get a sustainable system, those are things that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, it seems to me that in your going through the criteria for developing something, you've left out perhaps one of the most basic things, and that is the nature of the opposition to reform. And that is major employers in particular who are profiting, perhaps not in the long run, but in the short run, from low wage, low skill, very, very frightened immigrants, you know, like major home builders and so forth. And in our country, as it's set up now, that's enough to block any act of Congress. How do you go about making it in their interest, at least not to oppose immigration reform?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I don't leave it out. I pay a lot of attention to that. I didn't stress it as much as I ordinarily do, but you're right. You see, one of the problems with low-wage immigration is that employers become addicted to it. And one of the problems with unauthorized immigration is they become addicted to it. Now, the reason they become addicted to it is because they're following a low-wage strategy. They don't want to train anybody, so they arrange the work in the construction industry, for example, so that you don't have well-rounded workers, well-trained, well-rounded, that you get if you serve an apprenticeship program, say. You get somebody who's a door hanger or can do one thing and are highly specialized. Now, they prefer the foreign workers for those jobs for a variety of reasons. One, they're cheaper. 2, you're more likely to have a ready supply of those workers, and you don't have to raise wages to attract those workers into your workforce. When people tell me that, as they used to, that the unauthorized workers only take jobs Americans won't take, I said, like what? I don't know a job that is filled entirely by immigrant workers. You know, you can do other things besides hire low-wage workers from other countries. What I would do, and I think a well-managed system would do, in protecting, say you can never bring in anybody into this country for the sole purpose of paying lower wages. That would be illegal. So in order to enforce that, you would have to establish some real prevailing wage levels. is if you want to hire a foreign worker and meet all these other qualifications, you must pay at least, and the Australians, Canadians, and the British do that. They use the wage as a way to screen and to say, if you don't pay at least that much, then you're bringing in people just because they're low-wage workers. Now, what happens to you when you do that, when you follow, that's the reason the low-wage strategy is pernicious, is it will destroy a good industry, as it did, say, with the UK construction industry. You're going to pay low wages, you don't want to train anybody. So you do away with your training. When you do that, you become a lot less concerned about quality and productivity. So the work is not as good. And then pretty soon, when those Poles you brought in, skilled Polish workers they brought in from Eastern Europe, decide to go home because Poland starts developing, you're left with a real shortage, no training capability, and an economic basket case. And that's what's pernicious about that. The other pernicious thing about it is that if you're pursuing a low-wage strategy, the only way you can even maintain your income is to work harder, more hours. The only way we've maintained the real family incomes in the United States since about the 1970s is more women working, longer hours. For the family sells more labor. That's self-limiting, isn't it? There are not many families with another wife to put in the workforce. And if you don't turn that around and start improving productivity and quality, working smarter, you're in big trouble. So we should not allow employers to do that.
Dr. Marshall, we want to thank you for helping us understand a very complicated issue much better, and I am very happy that President Obama has enlisted your help in addressing these complex issues. Thank you for coming and talking with us, and please come back.
Well, thank you.